Alright, that has to finish that playlist, at least the second playlist, for those who desire to actually will name that playlist why all surviving Victorian clauses are black, but it is a continuation of the playlist how to acquire 1890s upper class British men's clothing when originals won't fit. So, having established that nearly all, I would say 80 to 90% of all surviving clothing, and I have to say one more thing. No, let me first finish that. So, 80 to 90% of all surviving 1850, almost nothing survives before that. 1840. Almost nothing survived before that. 1840 to 1920. Menswear, forget the women's wear, I'm talking about menswear, is black or very dark and formal. Or at least is the semi-formal city attire, which is still very formal. Obviously I'm talking about the actual clothing, not the underclothing. The underclothing almost does not survive except some shirts, which again are the formal shirts, in other words the formal evening or day shirts, which are white. So, same problem. And so just forget the shirts and stuff for a minute. Again, almost all British, or for that matter, Western clothing, or even European clothing, that European as a whole, including the United States of America, including Australia, New Zealand, and that is it. So, almost all the clothing, menswear that has survived from the year is from after the year 1840, so that has survived from the year 1840 into 1920, will be black, or very dark and formal, and will be small, and will have belonged to the upper middle class precisely because of the upper class clothing in percent. More has survived, but these are not available. When to after sale it is rare, they go on special auctions which are extremely expensive. So they start off, for example, a shirt at $500 or pounds, which would be extremely expensive, and it will easily go very high up and end up at 3,000. If you get all your clothing like that, you have to be rich. And those auctions are usually, one has to be pleasant and so travel, so again, pay plane tickets, have the time for that. They do not go on eBay. When they go on eBay, it is extremely rare and the price starts extremely high, and they usually never are on eBay, never. So most of the 80 to 90% that can realistically be found and is available on Etsy, eBay or in bazaars, it is better to purchase on Etsy or eBay than otherwise, will be black, will date not prior to 1840, and will have belonged to precisely the upper middle class. And in some instances the middle classes. Almost nothing has physically survived from the vast majority of people who were working class. So, about the other places, I said Western or similar clothing with suits and all. So when in the west of Europe, including Eastern Europe, including parts of Central Asia. Do not forget that Russia is part of Central Asia, and including the United States of America, Australia and New Zealand, which were obviously colonized until the 19th century by people who came from Europe, those ex-Central Asian albinos, in other words, people like me, my breed, whatever. Do not, somebody will tell me they also used to dress like that in Japan, because by that time, by 1890, a lot of the world had westernized, either because they had copied us, or most likely because they had been invaded, colonized, or at least highly influenced by us, like the Japanese. We were not colonized, but who began trading with the Europeans in the 1830s, especially 60s. And so by 1890, a whole class of Japanese, usually the upper middle and upper classes, will also have traditional Japanese dress. Actually, it is not traditional because their fashion also evolved, but let us say Japanese dress, which technically even for men are dresses and look nothing like the European now, but they also used to wear a lot, if not most of the time, for those classes, clothing which for all instances and purposes are almost identical to what was worn in Britain and all. Those items of clothing, you might think then it's okay if I want to dress British or at least European, I can get it from those countries, Japan, France, Germany, whatever. So I would take each of those countries one by one and try to analyze the situation there, what occurred, and why had less surviving pieces been. In Britain, by, as I explained, World War I, those pieces, usually even from Japan or whatever, would have survived, especially from the 1890s, because one simply goes 30 years back into the past. So why flip something which is only 30 years old? And because of the situation of World War I, which then accumulated in even worse World War II, people suddenly realized the value of those things, that the world will never be the same, those things will stop being produced, and so they kept it, even if they did not keep it within the family, even if they sold it or gave it for free. The people that would receive it, in other words, the people that received it for free or that purchased it, will still realize the historical value, and they will purchase it, and it will be sold initially not for you to wear or to use as a rag, but for you to keep as a precious antique, or at that time vintage piece. In Japan, in many other places, probably even Turkey and all, and that mentality was not there. Where the mentality was at its peak of conservation from World War I onwards was in Britain, because Britain was the most modern place until World War I, and suddenly they were far behind and not modern and rich at all and not powerful at all compared to what they had been. And so suddenly, because they were one of the smartest people, true to their richness before, they suddenly realized if we still want to look pristine, we have to use what we can use, because realistically surpassed the Americans. We were not really entering into the war as much, and so we were suddenly in front of them and said, hey, so let's preserve our culture, those stuff. That mentality, as further as one goes away physically speaking from Britain, the further one goes from that mentality. In other words, the closest people to that mentality, I suppose, are the French after the British. But the French were not as close, and until today are not as close to that mentality. Hence the reason for which those antiques purchased upon the French eBay or in French or simply in France usually cost less, because people see less of the historical value, although the piece in itself may be as rare and date from the same era and be as well constructed. And then the further away one goes from these places, the less that was the case. I do not know what was the situation in Turkey, but I also simply know that in Turkey most people did not dress like that, only a minority of middle class, which were even more minor there, and upper classes. And again, not all of them that dressed like that. And when they did dress like that, it was usually really British, because they were influenced by British tailors who came to Turkey. But they also added Turkish elements to their dress, in other words, construction techniques and even hats and things. And I do not know what is the situation there. Have they conserved those things as much as in Britain or more, or whatever? All I know is that there is no Turkish eBay, no Turkish Etsy. How will you acquire it, especially if you only speak English, and most of those persons only speak? Or if they speak English, only a minimum of it. Would you go to Turkey? Would you go to bazaars in Turkey? Do they sell it in bazaars, even if they have it at home? Are you able to speak Turkish to get the price down? How much do they sell it for? So on and so forth. As for example, something I had never known about in the Latin culture, especially Spain. I've read off somebody. Almost nothing has survived. So if you find a Spanish coat from that era, it will most likely be extremely expensive, and you will wonder why. It is from the same era, the same fit, usually too small, and the same quality. And in fact, Spanish coats, because of how to tailor them, it usually costed less because they put less cloth in it. But as part of the Spanish culture, every time somebody died, whether man or woman, they thought it brought bad luck to the family, so they would throw away the clothing. Stupid, right? And that persisted until at least the 1920s. And in many cases, especially for all the fashion families or families who could more afford it, like upper middle or upper classes, that persisted until 1940. And after 1940, clothes clothing does not in the least look anything Victorian in construction, in cloth itself, or in cut, or whatever.